We are pleased to present a scale model of the new Bradley fighting vehicle.
Let's build it.
They're building it?
Oh yeah, I'm gonna build it. Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with a model showcase video for this 1/35th scale M2 Bradley infantry fighting vehicle. The model in this video is built for my own personal collection and is not for sale and or purchase. However, like I often mention in these videos, I frequently take on commission build projects from models ranging between 1/35th scale and 1/6 scale. For availability and pricing information, that would be best by contacting me through the email address listed below, which is info@EastCoastArmory.com. The model in this video is built predominantly out of the box. However, I went ahead and added a few scratch built add-ons here and there, bringing it up to the condition that you see here. We'll be going over all of this information, as well as giving this model a thorough in-box review. But this is going to be a longer format video just due to the sheer amount of features that this model does have. This may come as a surprise, but this thing here has a ton of stuff going on with it, and because of that, it's just going to lend itself for a longer format video. So with that in mind, you may want to go ahead and watch this video in segments, or possibly hit that gear icon in the corner to speed it up. Regardless, there's going to be a ton of really interesting info and facts coming for this model here, so sit back, enjoy, grab a bucket of popcorn, and if you're definitely a Bradley bro, I'm pretty sure you're going to enjoy this video. To start this video off, let's go ahead and take a quick walk around this model. And this is the M2 Bradley infantry fighting vehicle. If there was ever a vehicle that really needed to prove itself, it was the Bradley. When the Bradley first came to being, it was in the onset of the US responding to what the Soviets were doing with the BMP. Prior to this vehicle over here, we had the M113, which is an armored personnel carrier. Fully tracked, fully enclosed, keeps the troops safe to and from the point where they need to disembark and do their job. Keeps up with the tanks, great little vehicle. However, the downside with the M113 is that it can't really fight along with the tanks. The vehicle just has a top-mounted M2HB on it, and although it's, the Browning is great for many things, it does have its limitations. The Russians were really one of the first to have the concept of the IFV, and they did this with the BMP-1 and then later the BMP-2. When the West saw what the Russians were doing, they first crapped their pants, and then the second thing they did was said, hey, that's a really good idea. The difference between an APC and an IFV is, like I stated before, an APC is just a taxi. It gets you to and from the battle zone. But the IFV basically almost acts like a quasi-light tank. It can keep up with the armor, and it can also engage targets much along the lines as a light tank can. But at a certain point, it could drop off the infantry, and it could also support the infantry much better than a standard APC. This was a very revolutionary concept. Indeed, that was, again, first really pioneered by the Soviets. So the idea was so good that the United States military essentially decided to steal their look, and thus began the development of what eventually led to being the Bradley. Although during the vehicle's development period, there was some design by committee that interfered and got involved, and this is well documented and well comedically illustrated in the movie The Pentagon Wars, but essentially that's more or less what happened. The vehicle's design was more or less based upon lessons learned from the M113, and many of the M113's design cues carried over into the Bradley. Such things would be the composition of the armor, for instance, being made out of aluminum as opposed to steel, which is good for several reasons. One, it is lighter. Two, it can be air mobile. Three, the thing was originally intended to float and swim, and I'll circle back to that in a second. And the other thing is for deflection of small arms, the aluminum armor is more than suffice at the job at hand. The other thing that was carried over from the M113 was really the design of the rear ramp area. That was pretty much figured out on that platform and just carried over albeit in a slightly different format, onto the Bradley. The Bradley was actually going to be part of a new generation of American military vehicles that were in development at the same time. Of course, one of which was being the M1 Abrams, the new main battle tank. And this vehicle, one of its key attributes was it had to keep up with the M1, and this is again where the aluminum armor is going to become handy. Of course, the biggest difference between the 113 and the Bradley was with the armament. Rather than having an exposed M2, the Bradley was going to have a fully revolving turret, and in the turret was going to feature for the main armament a 25mm M242 Bushmaster. The secondary armament was going to be the then brand newly adopted M240, which is the FN Mag in 7.62 NATO. But what's also really interesting was the idea of having the infantry be able to engage targets while inside the vehicle, and this was going to utilize the Colt M231 port firing weapon. However, the other bit of weaponry that this vehicle was going to encompass was the use of 2 TOW anti-tank guided missiles. And in the Pentagon Wars movie, this is where they go kind of off track because they were making it seem like it was part of the committee, but this was all done deliberately because this is exactly what was done by the Soviets. If you look at the BMP 1 and 2, they feature a fully revolving turret with a main ordnance, originally a 75, but then later on a 25mm autocannon, or a 37mm autocannon, specifically after what they ran to in Afghanistan. But they also had anti-tank capabilities in the form of a missile, with being the Sager on the BMP-1, and the BMP-2 had another system similar. As for the quote-unquote porthole firing system, this again lifted directly from the Soviets. Only the Soviets did it in a more Soviet manner, where you just utilize your standard Kalashnikov, and you just stick it through this slot, and now you can use it. The Americans, we tend to overcomplicate things, so we had to have a dedicated M16 pattern of rifle in order for that, which is a really cool thing in its own right, but that's not a topic for this video. Regardless, the vehicle entered into adoption in 1981, and it's still in use with the U.S. military up until today. The interesting about the Bradley is, again, when it first was adopted, it was basically universally panned by the military analysts of the time. And after the first Gulf War and 30 plus years of constant successful service later, it has effectively proven that military analysts are literal idiots and they get paid to be wrong. One of the original capabilities that this vehicle had that was one of the committee features and was quickly dumped shortly after the vehicle really began fielding was the ability for the vehicle to be amphibious. This was done with the use of a DD type skirt that would elevate, and the front had this bizarre looking bow plane that would open up, and this would allow the vehicle to float across a river or, short little body of water. And this design actually traces back to the M551 Sheridan that had the exact same feature in it, and it just carried over onto the Bradley. This was dumped right after the vehicle received one of its first upgrade programs, being it the M2A2, where they replaced the amphibious capability in lieu of just giving it some more armor protection. Before we continue with the video, let's go ahead and take a step back to when this model was first started in order to get a good idea of what the base starter kit supplies you with. And here's the model at the start of the build. For the base starter kit, I'll be utilizing this vintage Tamiya M2 Bradley IFV kit. This model is the textbook definition of a stash inhabitant. This model here I purchased back in 2008 and has been sitting in the stash literally ever since. And to show just how long this thing has been sitting in the stash, probably see the box getting cleaner by the second. Ugh. Yeah, this thing is cruddy. And the funny thing is, this was actually underneath several other kits, and yet it still got that dusty. That's how long this thing's been sitting in the same place. This kit here is a really interesting one. This was always one of those kits I always wanted and lusted over ever since I first saw them in the Tamiya catalogs back when I was a kid. And if anyone looked through those old Tamiya catalogs, they just have magic to them, don't they? The model was built in this format with the rear ramp down. It had the interior. It looked awesome. I always wanted to grab one, but for one reason or another, I was never able to track one down. Well, fast forward to 2008, I was at the New Jersey MosquitoCon model show with my 1/6 scale M10 tank destroyer, which, by the way, I actually won that show, first place, and also Best of Show award. And while I was there, there was another individual who had a 1/35 scale diorama, and he had this exact kit on it. That model, I swear to God, looked absolutely gorgeous. It was one of the best painted and weathered M2s I've ever seen in my life. I love the model so much that when I was in the vendor area, I saw a vendor who was selling this kit right here, and I just bought it right there on the spot. Why this is important to point out is that at this time, I wasn't really building 1/35 scale tanks anymore. I was primarily focused on growing the ECA catalog and doing 1/6 scale. That 135 wasn't really something I was actively pursuing at that time, so I just bought the model sheerly out of impulse because I was that impressed with the one that I saw in the show. Well, it sat in the stash, fast forward till today. Finally, I'm going to be able to crack this one and tackle it myself. As for the Tamiya Bradley kits themselves, they are very interesting in their own right because Tamiya does have the moniker of being the very first company ever to produce this pattern vehicle in 1/35 scale. The Bradley kits date back to 1985, which is noteworthy because these vehicles were basically just adopted at that time by the US Army. When these kits first came out, they were released in two formats. The first one is labeled as the M3, and you can see the box art of that vehicle right now, where it has the Merc camouflage pattern, which obviously is definitely more than appropriate for this vehicle during this era. This vehicle, the M3 specifically, was an exterior model kit only, and it was also static. I'll touch upon that momentarily. Then, at the same time, Tamiya released this particular kit here, the M2. The M2 differs from that other kit because this one here gives you the full interior, which is a playbook that they lifted directly from their M113 kits that were released a number of years earlier. Circling back to what I mentioned before about the kits being static, what's interesting to point out is that even though the kits were only sold as static, Tamiya designed the kit to be motorized. If you look at these kits, and you'll see it once I crack the box open, the hull has the provisions for mounting on a gearbox. However, for one reason or another, Tamiya never went ahead and actually produced a model in a motorized format. And it's one of those quirks that are found in not just this kit, but several other kits from the late 1970s and into the 1980s timeframe. As the years went on, the M3 kit was slowly phased out. However, the M2 stuck around for much longer because probably of the interior detailing. It's also important to point out that after the Gulf War time frame, Tamiya would revisit their tooling for this kit over here and revise it, giving you the updated version, which is the M2A2 that had different side armor and other provisions that are present on that kit. And as time went on further, when Operation Iraqi Freedom came around, Tamiya would again take their M2A2 kit and add several other details which would better make it represent a vehicle from that conflict. These kits here I don't believe are in production anymore and have been for some time. I remember in the 1990s looking through Tamiya catalogs and I still remember seeing this particular version listed, but this was eventually just replaced with the other version with the later pattern of armor. And also, I don't believe they've ever re-released this one in recent years. So chances are, if you're going to find one of these kits, it's going to be a vintage kit from back in the day that's new old stock. One other thing I do want to mention, and it is a noteworthy point, is that at the same time Tamiya kits were being produced, both the M3 and the M2 with the interior, it wasn't the only option available for this particular vehicle because our favorite South Korean company, Academy, went ahead and said, hey, that's a nice, cool kit there. Shame if anyone were to go ahead and copy it. And that's exactly what they did with both the M3 and the M2. So for a while, if you did not have the ability to acquire the Tamiya one, you would go with the Academy one because it was the exact same tooling and both kits would give you basically the exact same end result. However, we're not here to talk about knockoff Fugazis. We're here to talk about the original OG. So let's go ahead and look at the box art and graphic design. So starting with the box art, Tamiya never disappoints. They have a fantastic way of taking the most minimalistic things and just making them into high art. And the Bradley box art here is definitely no exception. I absolutely love this box art. The vehicle is very beautifully illustrated. All the details are there, and oddly enough, the details are better on this one than they are on the actual kit on the inside, which you'll see once I crack the box open. You can see right here it has the money shot being the open ramp right here. We have a nice glimpse of the interior. The interior detailing is excellently rendered. We even have the M231 port firing weapon right over there, which was a thing found on the early versions of the Bradley. And you can see the remainder of the detailing being just exquisitely rendered. It even has the nice little 56 marking that's duct taped to the side of the vehicle, and we even have the blank adapted barrel painted over there in red, which would be found when the barrel would be in that type of configuration. The tow missile system is in the up area. Again, it's just a very nicely rendered vehicle. M2 right there with the Bradley logo right next to it. It's in that typical Tamiya type face. Bradley, and then we have some other information right there about the vehicle in question. As for the side tab here, this is what the side tab looks like. We have a nice thumbnail version of the illustration in question. The name, Tamiya logo right there. Same with the opposite side. Like I said before, I got this thing for 15 bucks, and that is definitely a nice little thing to add. On this side here, we have some other illustrations showing the interior detailing that is found on this kit, along with the tank commander figure, and we have another cutaway version of the box art. On this side here, we have a different version with the Merc camouflage pattern, which normally would be really tempting to paint in this format, but for this one here, I'm going to go with the box art. I just love that olive drab on the cover, and you can see the actual vehicle here that the illustrator used for inspiration. And again, you can even see it has the red barrel, just like the one on the actual box art itself. The usage of real photographs was something that Tamiya has done on and off on several of their kits over time. Their M68-3 did it, as well as their AAV-7, and even their Joseph Stalin 3 did it a number of decades later. So this is something that they would do on and off. It's not exactly a rule of thumb, though, from things that are generally Tamiya. Okay, best part of the unboxing, seeing what's actually on the inside. So, first and foremost, this is an all-injection molded plastic model kit. No photo etch, no turned aluminum, nothing fancy like that. Old school plastic kit all day, every day. So, starting with the lower hull, as I touched upon before, these kits were originally intended to be motorized. Although Tamiya themselves would never actually put the motorization feature in them, they still have the provisions for the motorization option. We have the cutouts here for the gearbox to fit in. We also have the sliding rails for the gearbox to fit in place, and the mounting screw slot is right there. In addition to that, we have a cutout section right over here for the drive shaft to protrude through so we can actually make contact with the sprockets without causing any sort of extra ugliness right here on the front portion. Because this one does also have the interior, just like with the M113, they have several other provisions on the inside over here in order to affix the interior components. One other thing I want to briefly mention is that the color on the kits are this flesh tan beige type color, and this is something that's seen on many other of the modern era Tamiya military vehicle kits from this era. So if you built the Sergeant York, the M68-3, obviously the Bradleys, the M1 Abrams, they were all molded in this type of material. So aside from the plastic, moving to the side sections, you can see the hull detailing. This one here, just like with their M113, features all of the torsion bar components as integrally molded onto the hull pan itself, which makes assembly quite easy. However, some people would consider this a ding on the older kit. From the hull brings us to the track, and of course, this being a vehicle kit of its era, and it's a Tamiya kit no less, it utilizes the lovely, gorgeous, and sorely missed single-piece vinyl tracks. Too bad Tamiya can't take a hint and re-add these tracks to their current lineup of kits because they went with the cancerous individual link and length. Seriously, Tamiya, what the hell? But this one here has the big brain approach, and they went with the single-piece vinyl. They're on par with the other tracks that Tamiya included with their tanks of the period in both the materials used as well as the quality on the surface detailing. You can see that the links are all rendered out with the rubber track pads right there dead center, as well as the track rousers, which would be appropriate for a Bradley of this era. On the inside portion here, we still have some inner hinge detailing. It's a little bit on the simplistic end compared to some of the other more contemporary kits or workable track link options out there, but needless to say, these tracks are more than suffice for the task at hand. So opening up the first bag takes us to the suspension components. As you can see, it is the exact same runner, just duplicated. And here you have all of the components to flesh out not just the suspension, but several of the other components that are found on this vehicle, namely the ones that you're going to be using a lot of. So starting with the road wheels, you can see that the detailing on these components are excellent. This would include the hubcaps, the stamp pattern on the rims, as well as the lug nuts and rubber tires. All those details are nicely represented. You can see the sprocket detailing right over there. I believe the later versions of the Bradley, they revised the sprocket hub where it was skeletonized much along the lines of an M113, but for this early pattern here, the sprockets you see are the ones that are supplied. And the rear idler wheel is actually very excellent with its detailing. It's basically the exact same idler wheel which is found on the US Marine Corps AAV-7, as is basically the remainder of the other suspension components, but that's a topic for another video for another day. On the same runner, you can see right there the idler wheels, which are decently rendered as well. And we have several options for machine gun ports. We have the 2 closed and the 2 open ones. And if it's going to be open, you might as well include the armament that gets fitted inside, which are these 2 M2 port firing weapons, which by the way are probably one of my more favorite niche variants of the M16 platform. It's a really cool unit. Ian from Forgotten Weapons has a whole video on one, and I recommend checking it out if you're just into that type of stuff as much as I am. We have here the rack that goes on the rear corner of the Bradley, the brush guards, some ammo cans, flare box, basically a lot of amenities that are generally found on these 1980s era of American vehicles. Obviously, the other runner is the exact same stuff, so no point going over that. This leads us to the next runner. With the runner out of the bag, you'll clearly notice that this sprue here contains the upper hull section as well as the turret components. The upper hull is a single molding, and it's very nicely rendered out with all of the complex angular geometry which is found on the Bradley. It's actually a bit more complicated than many people might think it is, but you can see the quality details are very nicely rendered out. Again, quite typical for what you would see on anything Tamiya. The grill work here is very finely molded, so you have to be very careful when you're painting this model. Make sure your paints are very nice and thin. Otherwise, you're just going to have a flat plate up here as opposed to the grill work, which is integrally molded on. On the turret, same type of quality is present. The periscopes are integrally molded on, which is something that is generally seen on older kits, but just like I mentioned on the Sergeant York video, they do paint very well. The turret is a multi-part assembly, and from what I remember on the Academy one that I built in the past, that may or may not be making a cameo in this video, these turret halves go together very easily. So with this runner out of the bag, you can see that this contains all of the interior detail components. Tamiya, being as efficient as they are, were able to mold all of their interior parts on a single runner. Also, they pulled a page from their M113 kit that was released about a decade or so earlier, where they went ahead and molded all of the interior parts in this light gray plastic color, as opposed to the other components that are molded for the model. The interior, of course, would be seafoam green on the real vehicle, and this is something I am going to be touching upon as the video continues. On the floorboard here, you can see that it is the largest component on this sprue, and basically gives you everything from the driver's compartment all the way back to the ramp. The details are pretty good, where you can see the little tie-down sections. There is no diamond plate found on these areas over here. However, I believe this may be true to form to the real vehicle. If anyone is a Bradley crewman out there or a former Bradley crewman out there, feel free to mention that in the comment section below in case I am mistaken. The other larger components consist of the driver section over here, which this wall would separate the driver from the engine bay and power pack, which would be on the opposite side. However, this does not have that detailing present. It is purely just a fighting compartment interior detailing only on this example. The other thing to mention is the cage over here for the turret. It has the appropriate detailing and embossed stampings on all those metal components. And it should go together very well, and it's probably one of the coolest aspects I always found on the interior portion of the Bradley. Some other interior components would be some spare sections of the tow missile launcher tubes. We have several seats that are present. We have the driver's seat, we have the driver's handlebars right there, and we also have a nice holder that contains the ammo cans, which are all present on the interior. All these details are quite typical for what you expect on Tamiya kits of the past, as well as also even in the present. The next baggie over here contains some polycaps, some clear plastic, as well as some mesh. This was something that was always a staple on these Tamiya kits, specifically from this period. Obviously, the polycaps are used for mounting on the suspension. The mesh work is probably for some bustle bin or some kind of a gypsy rack of some sort. And the clear section is for some kind of a gunner's periscope or other type of detailing. We're going to see how that pans out as the video goes on. Right over here we have a decal sheet. In the past, I've had some very good results on the Tamiya decals in both old and new kits, so I'm not expecting any problems with these ones over here. However, I will say that on a recent build, namely my Sergeant York, the Tamiya version, the decals were a little bit tricky to get off of the paper. However, I was still able to achieve the decaling without any real problem. So I'm probably expecting the same type of level of effort required for these ones here. But again, I'll mention that towards the end of the video. The very last sprue takes us to one of the largest in the entire kit, and that is the remainder of the model's details. So we have the fenders. We have the skinny one on one side, and I always found that asymmetrical fender design on the Bradley to be a little bit funky, but that was just how the vehicle is. We have the rear hatch area, we have the rear ramp area, and also a separately molded submarine hatch, as I always used to call them when I see these on the AAVs and the M113s, and the Bradley's no different. They always kind of remind me of submarine hatches. We have here the ramp detailing found on the intersection right here. And we have that goofy bow plane system, which was an iconic bit of detailing found on these early versions of the Bradley because it had a DD type weighting system. But more information on that is to come. Here you can see more of that submarine hatch detailing right over there. The tow missile housing. The mantlet for the Bushmaster. As well as the shovel and all the other Pioneer tools. All the components are quite typical for Tamiya, which, needless to say, is pretty good. The very last thing in the box is something that you definitely don't see anymore and is a product of its era, and that is a tube of really crappy glue that these models used to supply you with. This is something that really does iron this vehicle out to a certain time frame, which was definitely the 1980s. This kit here is probably, I was going to say older than me, but that's not the case. I'm actually a year older than this kit, so me and this kit and this tube of glue here are basically the same age. And the glue isn't hard yet, so that's good. That means I still have some youth left in me. Last but not least takes us to the instructions. Here you can see the excellent Tamiya instructions, and again, Tamiyas always have some beautiful showmanship with their instruction manuals. We have here a built version of the M2 kit, but this one is in the Merc camouflage pattern. And we have some lovely information on the vehicle in question and its history. And it's all in Japanese, but we do have a really cool little sketchy drawing here of one of the precursors of this vehicle, which is probably the one they were talking about in that movie, The Pentagon Wars, but that's already been debunked. Anyway, here we go. You can see all of the awesomeness, which is a 1980s Tamiya instruction manual. We have the really cool little character guide telling you to read the instructions, and it's all in Japanese, which is awesome again, but that's okay. Their pictures and their pictograms were always really easy to follow. Tamiya instructions were always the gold standard, and I'm not expecting any changes here. Well, see that in a second. They have all of the color guides right there telling you which color to paint everything. Again, Tamiya instructions are just very well thought out, and I'm not predicting any sort of issues with these instructions here. Of course, if I encounter anything, I'll be sure to mention that in the video as it progresses. I miss their little anime cartoon guys. On the very rear portion of the instructions, as a separate piece of paper, we have a nice little painting guide that gives you a good illustration of how to apply the Merc camouflage pattern to this vehicle, as well as the olive drab version, which is the one I'm going to be rolling with. And again, Tamiya never disappoints with their little caricatures. Or at least they did until they got lame and boring. They don't really do this anymore. Seriously, Tamiya, gotta get back to your roots. So here's the model really early on in its production. At this point here, I've already started to assemble several sub-assemblies of the interior, as well as I also made some modifications to the model at this point, and it's best to showcase it at this point rather than once everything is fully painted and weathered. So without further ado, let's go ahead and start with the lower hull. So at this point here, I've basically just been going through the motions, assembling several of the suspension pieces, which would include the mounts for the idlers, which, by the way, on this kit here, there's two options for these, and this is the one that's requested in the instructions. As for the other one, honestly, I'm not sure. Maybe it's for the motorized version, which never came out, or it's probably for the other version of the Tamiya M2 Bradley kit, but that's neither here nor there. Regardless, the pieces are clearly marked, and they simply get mounted to their appropriate location. On top of that, you can see the final drives have been mounted at this time. Out of the box, nothing really much to mention, along with a few other little odds and ends, such as the ramp section, bulkheads, the guards, the mud guards specifically, as well as these two boxes, and of course the rear taillights. But the real modification that was made was with this front section over here. As I mentioned before, this kit was originally intended to be motorized by Tamiya, and these motorization features carry over into this static variant, of course. Well, with the interior, I do wanted to plug these sections up just so that it makes the interior much more solid compared to, you know, looking into and seeing these large gaping holes found on the inside. And this was done with just some sections of sheet styrene. As you can see, I plugged up this area here where the gearbox would have been slid into place, and I also plugged up the top portion for the clearance of the actual drive shaft. This was done to both sides, even though this side here, it's not going to be visible because of the engine compartment, but it's one of those things where if I did it to one side, you know, might as well continue it over. On the underside here, you can see I went ahead and blended everything in with a little bit of super glue and some sand polishing. Now, keep in mind, on the Bradley, with the way the side skirts are, you're not going to see into here, so you don't have to be as thorough as you need to be on some other type of kits that are out there. But again, you know, just a couple once-overs should be more than enough to do the job. That's really all there is to the lower. From this point, this entire section here can be primed with flat black, and then I could continue with the actual paintwork, but, you know, I'll circle back to that momentarily. So here's the upper hull. You can see some of the interior fittings have already been dropped into place. Nothing really much to go over there. And this takes us to the floor pan. Floor pan consists of a number of components, namely the driver's stick, or I should say steering yoke, I guess is the best way to put it, and the front little bulkhead section. This is best assembled at this point here. Once the unit is primed, I'm going to then secure it to the hull, to which then I can go ahead and apply the base coat, or, you know, we'll put a pin in that. So from the floorboards brings us to the remainder of the interior sub-assemblies. Here we have the firewall with its little stick shift right there, assembled at this point. We have the turret cage. This is a two-piece assembly, so there is a seam to contend with, which you can see, well, you're not going to be able to see it once it's fully painted, but there was a seam found in this section over here. Unfortunately, the seam is really easily polished away with some thick super glue, as well as a flat needle file. With the way the piece is designed, we have these rigidity ribs found on these sections over here, and with the way the needle file is, it fits in perfectly in between these sections, allowing you to polish down further. Outside of that, the pieces go together very well, you know, as one would imagine from a Tamiya. And the remainder of the internal details that have been pre-assembled at this time would be the spare tow missile tubes, as well as a large number of the crew seats. These here are all assembled out of the box without any sort of modifications being necessary. You just basically follow the instructions and progress away. These I like to pre-assemble at this point just because it makes the paintwork a bit easier compared to leaving everything on the sprue. You can still do that, but when you remove items and deburr them, it's going to pop out since, you know, some sections are not covered with the paint. So that's why for things like this, I like to pre-assemble them at this point, paint, weather accordingly, and then secure them to the model when the time does arise. On the turret, you can see I've already started doing sub-assemblies for this. The bottom pan here is a mosaic, and it consists of about 3 or 4 parts that all get glued together. They go together pretty well. The only thing you have to watch out for is making sure that everything is fully seated. With the way this piece is, it may want to slightly lift off while the glues are setting. So this is something you want to use some small micro clamps on, just to make sure that when the glue's set, it's all set in the appropriate manner. On the rear bustle bin over here, one thing that I went ahead and made a slight little modification to was with the perforations. These perforations are found on the tooling and they are nicely rendered on, however they are solid. And in order to enhance the model with a pin vise, I carefully, I cannot stress that enough, drilled out every one of those little holes. So here's what the underside looks like. Clearly this is best done before you glue this section to the bottom section, so you have full, access to this area over here. But yes, with a pin vise, I carefully drilled out every one of these, and somehow at the end I still retained my sanity, so that's good to point out. The piece does go together very easily though, regardless, holes notwithstanding. If you do not want to go through that work, you don't have to drill the holes out. The holes are nice and deeply molded into the plastic, so they look good from the outside portion, you know, from top looking down. But just for this model here, I decided, you know, why not? Let me go ahead and go the extra mile and drill those little bad boys out. So the next thing to mention is just the runner here for the remainder of the interior components. These pieces are all going to be painted on the runner, and then I'm going to be adding them to the appropriate locations when the time does indeed arise. So from here, that's all there is to mention about that. Let's go ahead and get the pre-paint work started on this build. And after a few more steps later, you can see what the interior looks like with its details all fully fleshed out. And as I always do in these videos with vehicles that have full interiors, I might as well show them at this point here before the model progresses any further, because once the model continues with its construction, you're really not going to be able to appreciate the interior detailing as you can right now before everything gets sealed up. So let's go ahead and zoom in where I could go over some of these fittings, because there's actually quite a lot going on in here, and it's best to go over it at this time. So the first thing I'm going to go over is actually the top section. This is done because, well, it's the easiest thing to do because there's not really a whole lot going on at this point. So on the interior portion on the top, we have about, 4 or 5 fittings that are fixed to the top portion of the vehicle. We have the center bulkhead that's right over here. We have this little section which has a double purpose. It gives you the interior detailing here of the periscope inserts, and it's also the rear locking mechanism that locks the upper to the lower. I'll be circling back on that in a moment, and why that's important. But the other details that we have here is the fire extinguisher, this tank of some sort, which again I'll be circling back to, and also the driver's instrument panel that we have right there. The only thing missing at this time are the M231 port firing systems, and these are going to be added, but as the build progresses, and probably going to be some of the last things that get fitted to this build. I was jumping ahead a little bit, but the first thing I want to mention is that the interior is all thoroughly primed and painted. For the primer coat, I went with flat black, as I always do, and for the interior color, I went with Tamiya Sky. Tamiya Sky is actually a very, very close match to the seafoam green color that is used on lots and lots of post-World War II American military vehicles. If anyone has seen the ECA YouTube channel, I recently did a few walkarounds of 2 V100 armored cars, one Air Force version and one XM706 Army version, and you will see in both of those videos when I'm on the interior, the color is basically what you see here. And the Tamiya color is a very good approximation for that tint. The unit, I should say all of the surfaces that after they were primed were thoroughly airbrushed over with the Tamiya Sky, and then of course everything has to be assembled in sub-assemblies because, there's a lot of stuff going on in here. In fact, I'll just come out and say it, this interior is actually deceivingly complex. You may see this kit and, think of its vintage being from the 1980s thinking, oh, it's just going to have some basic interior detailing, much along the lines as Tamiya done on some other kits like the M113, and I believe a few of the other 113 variants come to mind. However, this one here was probably the most in-depth in terms of some of the fittings that I'll touch upon in a second. And by the way, some of the other interior tanks like the M106 mortar carrier, for instance, was actually a pretty complex little model, but this one here is actually even more complex for some of these extra features that I'm going to mention. However, again, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, pumping my brakes, going back to the paintwork. Like I stated before, the inside, or I should say all the detail components that you see here, are first painted with flat black spray paint, and then the Tamiya Sky was airbrushed over. For the weathering, the first technique that I used was just my edging technique, which is using the airbrush in a slightly diluted form of Tamiya flat black. This was done on several of the surfaces, giving you the, my typical double edge type effect that are seen on the exterior portions of the model, and this one's going to have the same effect too, as you'll see as the video goes on. But aside from the edging, the next layer that went on was with the Tamiya panel line accent, and I used a black panel line accent, and it just makes the interior just look so good. It goes into all these little recesses over there and just makes everything just pop out. It really does a fantastic job. Like over here on the seats, like in those little recesses over there, you know, into the floorboards, that stuff just works magic. It's an excellent material, and I am going to be utilizing again on the remainder of the vehicle, as I always do. But here's what the stuff looks like once it has been applied. Excellent, excellent solution. The last effect is with dry brushing, and in here you'll see a dry brushing techniques of two different colors. You'll see it using the flat black technique for the small little chipping, and I also went ahead and utilized some silver paint for some other areas, like namely on the floorboards over here, where obviously these are going to get scratched up and scuffed up pretty, you know, easily and commonly, I should say. And that's also true for the driver's position and many other sections found on the lower sections, and even some edging as well. So that's all there is for the main paintwork. The next paintwork to mention are all the little fittings and features, and there's a ton of stuff going on in here. So the first thing I do want to mention is that there's not really a whole lot of reference material out there on the interiors of these older 1980s era of M2 Bradleys, which sounds funny because, you know, the Bradley, you know, it's been around for so long and there's lots of photographs out there of the interior, but even with the current ones, there's not really that much, namely like this nether region over here. It's kind of ignored and not really shown in a lot of photographs. Usually you see it like this or like that, or just, you know, take a peek in this way through the driver's hatch, but there's nothing really taken from in this little space over here. You know, quick, anyone out there is doing walkarounds, you know, be sure to, you know, hit that. But also, those Bradleys, like I touched upon earlier, are the modern, or the more modern type equivalents from the 90s into the 2000s, and this one here from the early 80s is very different in terms of its interior layout. As when the vehicle, you know, continued in service, the interior was revised quite a bit, so this one here, it's not really seen anymore on the current examples. So trying to figure out what gets painted and what colors they get painted was something that took a bit of detective work to try and iron out. I was able to find some photographs online on how some of the units are painted, and that did come in handy, but there were some components that honestly I have no idea what the color is on the actual vehicle. So fortunately I did have a decent aid, and that's found on the Tamiya box art itself. So right here we do have some very nice illustrations, as I touched on before in the unboxing portion. But here you get to see, for instance, the color of this tank that we have over here. As for what is stored inside this tank, honestly, I have no idea. But this is a fitting found, from what I can tell, from the earlier versions of the Bradley. And this was one of those fittings that was pitched as the vehicle went through its, you know, development. Well, on the real vehicle, this is actually made out of like a rotomold or a blow mold plastic type material, and this strap over here is actually just like a metal aluminum strap that secures it to the vehicle. And that's something that I replicated right over here. And this is just painted with some cream paint that I have. I use it for weathering and other techniques, and it does a pretty decent job with rendering out the rotomold, or a good approximation for the rotomold material that would be found on the real one. The strap is integrally molded on. That's just painted with a little strip here of aluminum paint or silver paint. And that's really all there is to mention about that. The other thing to mention was, again, for some of the other painting components, such as this, I believe this is some kind of a heater duct right over here, as well as this instrument panel, or what I believe is some kind of an instrument panel. For the paintwork on that, I was able to use the side portion here of the Tamiya box art, which you can see they actually did a pretty decent job with rendering out all of the little fittings on here. And if I go on this side over here, you can see where I got the idea for painting these two units in the colors that you see them on my model. Now, is this something that is accurate? Honestly, I couldn't tell. Again, I'm relying on this really dated illustration over here for that, but if anyone is a Bradley person out there and who served on one of these early renditions of the Bradley, feel free to mention that in the comment section. For this model here, I'm going to leave it obviously as is. And also, I kind of like that I went with that white color, kind of, you know, it just makes the inside just have a little bit more color pop to it, and something that is going to be more noticeable once I, open up the hatches on this thing. But as for why I picked it, again, I went with this one here. I felt pretty confident that this color should be fairly accurate because, again, the individual did a good job with rendering out that rotomold tub that we have here in the back. So, so far, I think if I, use this as a guideline, I think I should be okay. And with the camera brought in closer, you really get a good idea on how much color pop it does give to the model, along with that red pan section painted on that item, which to me is a bit of a mystery. I think it has to do with the heating or something. But again, any Bradley people out there, feel free to put that in the comments section. So on the rear portion over here, you get to see some other things that jump out with some color, like these two canisters in the back, which I believe are for the firefighting equipment, which is something that is fairly commonly seen on these military vehicles. They're just painted in red, and they do have their labels on them, which I'll be circling back to momentarily. On this portion over here, we have a lot of ammunition cans, such as the ammo cans here for the coax, which are 7.62mm NATO, as well as the main 25mm ammo cans. And there's a bunch more of those stowed right here on this side of the sponson. And all of these details are integrally molded, and you just have to carefully paint everything with a paintbrush in order to fully make them pop from the moldings. For these things, I went with Tamiya Olive Drab for the ammo cans, which does a pretty good job with replicating, the type of color seen on those. For the 308 cans, I went ahead and used two types of olive drab colors, as if anyone has been around a lot of these surplus ammo cans, they tend to have a bunch of different colors used for their OD, depending on when they were manufactured and used, so it's not uncommon to see a bunch of different ones with different colors. And also, it's a great way to add a little bit of extra color pop to your model without, again, really having to do all that much extra work. The next thing I want to mention are the tow missiles. Here we have the spare tow tubes. Again, the kit ones are all utilized and just simply painted. For the green color, I went again with Tamiya Olive Drab. And the other sections are just painted with Tamiya Flat Black. They look the part, and again, look really good, and just give the inside just so much more extra stuff in there, which is the lack of a better term to put. And it just does a pretty good job with that type of detailing. And once everything's thoroughly painted and marked, it just really, it definitely has a nice little detailed punch to it. The remaining details would include the driver's stick right here. There's no other detailing like pedals or anything along those lines. You just have the main steering system, and you do have the little stick shift right over there on the side. Note on this one here, I painted the entire stick shift box in black, and this is something I lifted off of a real Bradley example I was using for research. And on this sidewall over here, you get to see the access hatches to the engine and the engine compartment, and you can see the small little securing straps. And on this one, I painted them in silver, as again, this was something that was influenced from a real Bradley I was using for reference. Moving rearward takes us to the seats, and as you can see, this vehicle has a bunch of them found on this interior. And these units you do have to pay attention to, as some of the components are individual for certain applications. Fortunately, everything is very well thought out and very well marked in the instructions, and even the components themselves on the bottom portion, they have a little number molded in identifying what the part is, which is great and handy because once you clip everything off of the sprue and pre-assemble everything and pre-paint everything, of course, when it comes time for installing them in place, you kind of have to ID them, and that little number that's molded into the bottom portion where you can't see is definitely a nice efficient way that is done. As for the seats themselves, they are very, very nicely detailed. As you can see, they have the little holes on them, they have the little overhang portion of the backrest, and this is something that a lot of people may forget, but it is actually black. It's the same material that's found on the front pad sections, and just again, a little swipe of paint is all that's needed. The detailing is integrally molded in. You just have to paint it in order to get the look that you see here. On that note, I want to say that the fit of all the components were excellent. Absolutely no hand fitting was really needed in order to get everything assembled and fitted in place. It just all locks together basically like a puzzle. Is very, very nicely designed in that regard. And while also on the inside takes to probably my favorite part of this entire model, and that's the giant cage cylinder that we have right over here. The detailing on it is really nicely done, and one thing that you do have to paint, and I have to touch upon this, is this little band that we have right there in the middle portion. You note it's painted in silver, and on the real unit, I believe that's some kind of a duct, like a some kind of heating duct or whatever, because from what I've seen, it's some kind of like aluminum or like a fiberglass aluminum HVAC type material that you see on houses. But regardless, it is a silver color on all of the real Bradleys that I saw. So on this one here, again, the pieces are integrally molded in. You just have to paint them accordingly. If you're painting them, it's only the middle section that gets painted in silver. The top and bottom portions are the seafoam green that you see on the remainder of the vehicle. Once everything is painted and weathered, as you can see, it just gives so much nice extra color pop to this vehicle. And that's really all there is to the interior for now. This brings us to the top portion. I already talked about this tub earlier, and this brings us to the instrument panel. And the instrument panel is a nice bit of detailing, and it's kind of simple at the same time. The entire instrument panel is just one single piece, like you see here. It has this wraparound type effect, and just glues to the top portion of the upper hull without any sort of problems. The unit is all painted in black, again, as referenced from a real Bradley I was studying, but the actual detailing themselves is a decal. And now I'm just going to be jumping ahead to the next leg of the interior, which are the markings, and holy hell, this was something that threw me for a curve, because the amount of markings for the interior is just staggering. There are a ton of decals for this. And as I mentioned earlier, this is something that blew away every other Tamiya interior model that I've done so far. And I've done basically all the M113 variants. I haven't done a Martyr yet, so maybe that one might be on similar lines, but this one, the decals were everywhere, and you have to pay attention to them. Also, on that note, the instructions are all in Japanese, so many of the instructions that talks about the decals and also what colors to paint things are also all in Japanese. So I don't speak Japanese, so that's why I had to, you know, cobble things together from looking at photographs. But that is something I do want to mention. The decal layout is pretty good because they do use Roman numbers for that, so, you know, you should be able to ID the decals, but there are a ton of them. One of the most intricate is the instrument panel. As you can see, all of the little gauges, dials, starter switches, everything, it's all right there in a 2D format found on the decal sheet, and you have to simply just apply it to this item here and then secure it in place. All of the decals, by the way, that are applied were first applied, then the model actually had everything glued in place before, or I went ahead and sealed everything, and then once every component was glued on to their appropriate location after the decals were added, the entire interior was hit with the VMS matte varnish. The VMS, for obvious reasons, it, you know, looks great, but also it seals everything, and it does it in an excellent manner. And this is absolutely required because you'd want to get rid of any sort of decal shine or silvering. And it's also super uber important because it will keep the decals in place. And there are so many labels and things stretched out and strewn out all over this interior over here that if you don't secure them in place, they're just going to brittle up and blow away on you as time goes on. And that's something you don't want, specifically with a model with this much detailing on it. It's, again, it's really staggering how a model this old has this level of detailing. It's actually pretty impressive. So, circling back to the instrument panel, everything is a 2D format, and once the VMS matte varnish goes on, it makes it nice and flat, and it seals it in place, which is what you want. However, one way to enhance it further is, as you can probably see here, some of the items are gloss. Well, this was done with a little paintbrush and some gloss lacquer. I carefully applied the lacquer to all of the gauges so that when the unit's open, they have a sheen to it which represents or replicates a glass lens, which obviously for a instrument panel here is something that would be necessary. The decals themselves are excellent quality, and I'm jumping ahead a little bit to what I'm going to be touching upon later on, but for the interior ones here, I didn't really run into any problems with the units cracking on me too much. You do want to use some warm water that will prevent the decals from sticking to the paper as much as if the water is cold. And there are so many decals in here, it took me about 3 or 4 trips to the sink to constantly dump out the water because it kept on getting cool on me just because there were so many decals that were found on this interior. Some of them, and again, with the age of this model over here, the decals going on without any sort of problems was actually, again, something that's a testament to the decal quality found on these Tamiya kits. So that's it for the top one, or I should say for the instrument panel. That also takes us now to the fire extinguisher. Fire extinguisher, very nicely detailed. I went ahead and added the label, again, supplied with the kit. The only other thing I want to mention about the fire extinguisher over here is to properly paint the other amenities, which would include the little gloss plastic funnel, the rubber tube, the valve, and also the gauge. Gauge is right there. It's painted a different color from the valve, and I even hit it with a little drop of gloss just to give it that little sheen. The little straps are integrally molded on. Those should be the same color of the vehicle, so again, this was carefully painted with a paintbrush. The rear periscope inserts are olive drab, so I painted them with Tamiya olive drab, and the lens sections are painted with gloss black, giving you the type of sheen and look that you see here. That's it for the top. This leads us back to the hull interior. So we do have some warning labels, a whole stretch of warning labels right there on the engine hatch. We have some labels right over here on top of the stick shift, as well as on the wall on top of the stick shift. Some more markings on this little box here with the knobs. There's two specifically. The most tedious bit of markings were on each of the ammunition cans. Every ammunition can on this kit has the little yellow identification numbers or markings, which, by the way, is impressive that they were able to get legible in 1/35 scale, and doing that in the early 1980s with the 1980s technology that they had for decal printing, again, shows you just how good these Tamiya kits were at the time and even today. Even though today we kind of take Tamiya kits for granted, specifically with all the other super kits on the market from like Ryefield and Trumpeter and Dragon and Tacom, but Tamiya is no joke. Their kits are still some of the best, in my opinion. On the top portion over here, we still have some more markings along this top leading edge. Maybe difficult to see, but there are these like little perforation details. And these are decals. There's warning labels, warning label, warning label. Even both of these fire extinguishers have warning labels on them. Another warning label right over there. Every ammo can, again, has its ID lettering. It's true for the 25 mil cans as well as the 308 cans. And even though they're hidden behind this wall over here, they still each have their labels on them. Pretty forward thinking. On the toes, they have the little yellow stripe, the blue stripe, with, again, some more identification letters and information. Each tube gets its identification little markings right over there, and that's true for the 3 here on the stack, as well as the 2 here on the ready rack. Again, very, very tedious, but it's also very rewarding once completed, and it just looks awesome once fit inside the model. As you can see, once the roof gets put in place, it's just going to have so much extra color. It's very, very... I'm really enjoying my build right now, let me just say it that way. More labels right up here on top of the rubber covers. And there's many, many more that are still left. Basically, all the ones that you see here are just ones on the interior. There's still a bunch more that are going to be added to the outside of the vehicle, but we'll be mentioning that towards the end of the video. But as you can see, yeah, I am just... this kit here really did age very well and shows you just how good this kit was, again, back in the early 80s when it came out. There's a common theme you're going to be hearing in this video. So the last thing I want to mention about the interior, and it's actually an interesting feature that this kit has, is that unlike most of the other interior tanks that are out there where, you know, you build the interior and then you basically, you know, seal it up with the upper hull and the turret and all that, and then that's it. The interior is sealed off forevermore, you know, barring you could open up your hatches, if that on some builds. This one here, it's a bit of an exception. This is also true again for the other Tamiya kits from the same era, like the 113s. Because this kit here was originally designed to be motorized, the upper and lower hulls are designed to disconnect. So on the front portion, we have these 2 provisions for rubber polycaps, and then on the back, we have that little tang that I mentioned before. And with the way the kit is designed, now currently I don't have the polycaps fitted in place at this moment. That's going to be fitted, you know, after this scene is filmed. But basically, you go ahead and you can just lock the unit together like this, and in the front these 2 polycaps would just squeeze into place, and now the upper and lower hulls are firmly together. They will not come apart on you, and they do a fantastic job with holding everything together. Why this is awesome is that if you ever need to open up for one reason or another, like for instance, I'm going to be adding the M230, the port firing weapons at the very end of the build, just because they tend to hang out and get snagged on stuff and break. So that's going to be done at the very end of the build. Well, I could build the entire model right now and continue all the way to painting, completion, all that. Then when the time comes, I just pop it open, throw the M230 or the port firings in place, and then seal it back up, and I'm all set. No other damage is going to be done to the model. It's designed to come apart this way and come apart in a seamless manner, and that's again a testament to the way these kits were designed. Of course, the other benefit is that if you just want to look at the interior from time to time, without any tools, just boop, pop it off, and oh, there you go. You could check out your handiwork on all that lovely interior detailing that's present on the inside of this model. The very, very last thing I do want to mention about the interior is that even though this kit is pretty thorough with the interior detailing, it is still not all the way complete. If you look at a real Bradley, the inside has much more stuff dangling on the inside. Things like power cables, conduits, other sort of gizmos. We have the little latch mechanism that raises and lowers the ramp that is absent on this model. It's something that would have to be scratch built if someone is so inclined to do so. The other thing that is missing are these periscope details that we have right here for the port firings. We have the external details, however, there are no internal provisions. So that is one a mission that's present on this kit, and something that if you're a purist out there, it is something that you're probably going to want to have to just cobble or scratch build, along with all the other fittings that I just mentioned. Having said that, though, compared to some of the other tanks I've done with interiors on this channel, like on the LAV-25 from Italy, for instance, or even more recently, or I should say recent developed kit would be the Hobby Boss V100, the XM 706 series. Those are naked in comparison to this kit over here, and those came out almost 20 or 30 years after this kit has already been in full production. So again, it just shows you just how thorough Tamiya was on this model. Carrying on a little bit brings us to the model in the following condition. At this point here, the hull, for the most part, is basically ready to slide off into paint, but before I do, I need to go ahead and mount on the ramp as well as the two hatches. The ramp has already been pre-assembled out of the box. There's nothing really much to go over there, but the next thing to refer to are the two hatches, and this is something that needed to have been mentioned at this point here, because if I build the model and paint and everything, I don't think you're really going to appreciate this one aspect of it. And that's not with the exterior sections, but it's with the interior sections. So starting here with the rear hatch, you can see that on the Tamiya kit here, there are these two large and pronounced injection knockout marks that are found right over there. These are something that can hurt the look of the build. Specifically, they are going to be very noticeable once everything is fully painted, and if you have the hatches in the open position, they're going to be quite prominent. So on the model over here, I went ahead and plugged them up with a little bit of red putty, and then I just did some body work in order to smooth them out to the way that you see it here. With the confines of the inner portion of the hatch, getting access to this area with some sandpaper is actually very, very tricky and difficult, and so to do this, I actually had to incorporate an interesting trick. The trick that I utilized was actually borrowing some broken snap blades that I have right over here, and fortunately, with the way I had these pieces just lying around, they were the perfect length in order to fit into the tight confines here of the hatch. So with a plier, I was able to get a good grip on them, and then I was just able to pass the unit up and down the surface over here, gradually slicing off the material, and after a while smoothing out to the way that we have here. The razor blades did a fantastic job with removing the bulk of the red putty, and then I was able to get in here with some fine sandpaper in order to do the rest. This should be adequate at deleting the knockout marks in question. On the bow hatch over here, a similar story in terms of the knockout marks, only on this one here it's much easily accessible with the sandpaper, and I was able to take care of the knockout mark very promptly. Also on the front one, in between where the periscopes would be, there are also some knockout marks. These two were promptly deleted with the red putty and a little bit of sandpaper. Before I can get them fitted to the model though, these are going to be primed and painted so that, take two, so that when they are primed and painted, I could just secure them in place with the kit components, and then from there, the remainder of the tank could slide off into paint, and everything can be painted in one shot. This includes both the bow hatch, the rear hatch, as well as the rear ramp. Another thing to mention is that really iconic and arguably really doofy grill that's found right here on the front of the M2, or I should say of the original M2 Bradleys. The weighting fold-up flippy thing. I do have it. That is something that is going to be painted off of the model, and that's probably one of the last pieces to get mounted on the model at the very tail end of the build. For the reason of, well, just much along the lines as the bow plane is on an M113, there's a lot of surface area back here, and paint's just not going to get back to these recesses unless everything is painted separately and then assembled at the tail end. So that is something that is also going to be done on this build, but you'll see more about that as the video goes on. Well, as it turns out, the model wasn't exactly ready for painting in the previous scene. Now, the thing is officially ready for painting. So, back to the hull, you can see that the rear ramp here has been fitted in place, as well as the interior sections have been painted. Same is also true for the remaining crew hatches that I touched upon before. With the pieces fully painted now, you get to see that the bodywork was successful in eliminating those sink marks or knockout marks that I touched upon in the previous scene. Same is also true right here for the bow hatch. The inside portion here has been painted and primed prior to the remainder of the vehicle. This is done so that when it comes time for paint work, I could just button the model up in the following position and continue with the primer and the base coat, and the insides here will be protected and will also be a matching color as the remainder of the vehicle. And that's something that's always a feature that needs to be kept in mind, specifically by the builder who has a vehicle like this with working hatches and double trues for the ones with the actual interior detailing. Aside from the hull, brings us back to the little front bow plane section. The meshwork has been cut and fitted in place. This is the kit supplied mesh and was simply cut according to the kit parameters and mounted in place. It does a decent job overall. You can swap these out for a set of photo etch grills if necessary, but honestly I don't think that's really required, as the kit ones do the job, you know, by the most part, absolutely perfectly. The only thing that you do have to be aware of is paintwork, as something like this, and this is true for all mesh type features, be it photo etch or mesh, just like this one here, you have to be careful with the paintwork because these can easily get plugged up, and if they do, it kind of negates the whole detailing of the meshwork that it offers. So this is something that does need to be paid attention to by the builder. And also, this is why it's painted separately off the model, so that I can thoroughly get all these areas painted properly without there being any sort of collateral damage. Next thing to mention is the main Bushmaster. This is the kit part. Basically, it is a single piece molding, and there is a small little seam found on the mold halves, which is quite customarily seen on things like this. Easily polished away with an X-Acto, as well as just some fine sandpaper. A couple passes and you're good to go. On the muzzle end, I went ahead and drilled that out with a pin vise, just to give some added extra detailing. This is something you do want to be careful with because of the fins that are found on the side sections of the Bushmaster. If the bit is not completely centered, this can cause issues with drilling out portions that you really don't want to be exposed. So that's something that needs to be cautiously exhibited by the builder. But this will be greatly more appreciated after the model is fully painted and weathered. And we'll circle back to that. On the turret, as I believe I touched upon before, the bottom portion here of the gypsy rack had all of its preparations drilled out. However, you'll notice that's not yet secured to the model, and that's because I want to go ahead and thoroughly prime and paint this prior to the installation. With the way the Bradley turret is, the confines are so tight on the inside over here that getting paint into these recesses is something that can be potentially difficult. So in order to just play it safe, I'm going to go ahead and paint these sections off of the model and then mount them on at the appropriate time. The next bit of detailing takes us back to the interior here, and it's the final bit of details that I have not added yet on the model, and these are going to be done after the model's fully painted, for a reason that should be fairly obvious. Here we have the 4 M231 port-firing weapons, and these ones here are the kit originals. Like I said before, the kits versions are pretty good considering the scale as well as the vintage. And in order to spruce them up a little bit further, the one bit of detailing that's absent on the kit M231s is the grease gun pattern of folding stock. Well, this little detailing here was fabricated out of some thin pieces of floor wire. I just bent them to the appropriate shape and then glued them to the necessary locations found on the rear buffer tube. On the real M231, some had the stock in place and some didn't. Me personally, I kind of like the look of the stock, and it's going to add some extra detailing to the model, specifically once everything is painted and weathered. While on the topic of wire work, this brings us to the side skirts. And the side skirts on the original pattern of Bradley are very distinctive due to their bizarre stamped sheet metal appearance. And one place where the Bradley, or I should say the Tamiya kits, details fall a little short is with some of the details that we have here. So as you can see, this version of the Bradley does have several grab handles that are found on the side portions, and these are all absent on the stock kit. And it's one of those things that really do enhance the build once added. I do want to point out that I have seen lots of pictures of Bradleys from the 80s and early 90s time frame where many of these pieces are missing, but the holes are still found on the steel stampings. But for this one here, I wanted to go ahead and replicate it with those grab handles present. This was all done with just small, thin metal wire work, same wire that I used on the M231s. And in order to find the locations, fortunately there are some really good resources out there online that show an original version of the Bradley like this with a square side view of either side, which is instrumental because I could go ahead and plot out the locations where the grab handles need to be fitted. Once everything was plotted out, I drilled them out with a pin vise, and then the metal wire was simply bent to shape and then secured in place. This is going to be a fantastic bit of detailing, specifically once everything is painted and weathered, and it's really going to enhance this model compared to the stock configuration. Same is also true for the one on the opposite side, and also the Bradley is unique because it's one of those vehicles where the side skirts are not symmetrical. It's actually kind of bizarre in that type of respect, but here we have the locations for the opposite side. In addition to the grab handles, I also went ahead and added little bits of wire to these following locations. On the real Bradley, like I said before, these are just stamped sheet metal sections, and in order to get this curvature, there are slits found in various locations, and then these slits are just bent to shape, and then they are welded over. On some examples, I've seen some examples of the Bradleys, the one in Aberdeen specifically, where they weren't even welded. It was just like a slit over here from where the two pieces of metal were crimped in place. However, I have seen several online, some really good references where they are welded. So I went with the welded approach on this one here, and the weld beads are just mimicked with thin little pieces of wire that are just bent to shape and glued to the appropriate locations. Once everything is painted and weathered, all of this detailing is definitely going to come out in better focus. And here's the model coming towards the end of its construction. At this point, the build has been painted, weathered, and is about to receive its markings and varnishing. However, before I go ahead and do that, I need to go ahead and mount on the port firing weapons. So here you can see the M231s that I touched upon before. And since the last scene, the units have been fully painted, weathered, and at this point they are ready for installation. I did want to mention one or two things prior to the units getting installed, so you get it, because again, you get a greater appreciation of the paintwork at this point, as opposed to when I'm trying to show everything when it's stuffed inside the vehicle. When it comes to painting these or any sort of M16 or an AR-15 type unit, you want to remember what the pieces are manufactured in. This is different compared to some other weapons out there like an AK. On an M16 specifically, the upper and lower receivers are made out of aluminum forging. So when you weather them, you don't want to apply things like rust, and yes, I have seen people do that in the past. The upper and lowers are weathered with my typical dry brushing techniques. And the other paintwork is interesting to point out, namely the magazine. The magazine on an M16 type unit is anodized, and it's anodized in this grayish coloring generally. There are, of course, lots of different options available, but generally for a USGI magazine, they tend to be in this gray coloring. For this one here, this is actually Tamiya just Panzer Gray, and I applied it with the paintbrush, giving you the looks that you see here. The next thing to mention, and specifically true for the M231, but again, it's true for all ARs, is with the handguards, and it's just the furniture. On these units here, the furniture is made out of a plastic material, and generally the plastic is actually a dull type material, but it's not uncommon with extensive use that the plastic becomes very, very shiny. So on the model over here, I went ahead and replicated that. The pistol grip as well as the handguards are painted in flat black, and then afterwards I go over with a brush of Tamiya gloss in order to give you the sheen that we have here. You can also leave them in the flat format, which is standard Tamiya flat black, and this also will be appropriate, and it will show a weapon that has had as much handling compared to some others. But me, I kind of like the well-worn, shiny look found on the Bakelite, or I believe it's like a fiberglass type, fiberite material that's on the butt stocks. Regardless what material it is a fiberglass type material that are used for the handguard and the pistol grip. Also, on the M231, when you're painting one of these, the handguards on the M231 are very, very unique because they're very small and short. And on the unit over here, when you're painting it, you don't want to have the unit replicated having the whole front section painted with the handguard. On the M231, the end section over here is actually the provision that screws into the slot on the Bradley, and that's how the unit is fitted in place. The handguard is very, very small. It's a two-piece assembly, and basically the way you see it on the model here is how I replicated it. Also, as a quick side note, Colt went ahead and recycled the handguards and utilized them on the Colt 9mm DOE, but that's really for another channel. But regardless, when you're painting the M231, that's one thing that you do want to bear in mind. Of course, I utilize the exact same paintwork on all 4 of the M231s that are supplied with this model. And they really are going to look really nice once fitted to the vehicle. Starting with the model's running gear, all the details you see here are stock out of the box and no mods were made to them whatsoever. The only thing that I did was simply just paint the components appropriately. The rims are painted with the base coat and with the remainder of the base coloring, while the tires are painted with Tamiya rubber black on both the outside as well as the inner confines. This is something that I always do on my builds, and it's something that's not necessarily done by other individuals out there, but me personally, I like to thoroughly paint my tires both inside and out, inner rim, outer rim, even the ones that are on the inside portion, just for making the model a more thorough build. And for me, it just makes the model seem just that much more complete, as opposed to those people out there that omit this type of paint work. But again, it's very easily done. Fine point paintbrush is really all you need. In addition to these wheels here, there are some return rollers found on the top, but these are clearly covered up with the side skirts that you see here. If you want, you can potentially cut these sections off and render this model with one of the two of these segments removed, which is something that can easily happen with in-field use, but this is something that's best left up to discretion of the builder. The one other thing I do want to mention about the suspension is with the swing arms. As I touched upon earlier, the swing arms are integrally molded into the hull pan. But one bit of information I forgot to mention earlier on was that one thing that the Tamiya kit is lacking are the shock absorber details found on some of the swing arms. If I'm not mistaken, I believe the Bradley is very similar to the M113 and even the AAV7. In fact, it uses the same suspension from the latter vehicle. And on those vehicles, there are some shock absorber details found on the inner sections, and these are absent on the Tamiya tooling of kit. So again, this is something that kind of shows its age. Remember, this kit's from the 1980s time frame, and even the M113 kits from that era from Tamiya omitted this detailing as well. Fortunately, again, you don't really notice that at all because everything is covered up with the side detailing, but there are some people out there that this may be a problem for them, and if this is something that you're looking for, perhaps you may want to stick with one of the more newer tooling Bradley kits, or this is a bit of detailing you're maybe going to have to want to consider scratch building. But again, it's just something I wanted to point out. Moving rearward takes us to the idler, and the idler on this vehicle here is just like what you'll see on an M113 and also on the AAV, where they are not rubber rimmed but are steel rimmed. And this is important to point out because a lot of people out there that render these vehicles, they tend to not know this or think about this weathering technique, and they just leave the wheel with its section all painted with the remainder of the base. And on the real vehicle, that's just not really the case. The paint, or any sort of paint that's found on this section over here, would quickly rub off just with the vehicle being driven for a short duration of time. So if you're going to render this vehicle, the best way to do it is with a swipe of silver paint. You just apply it to the faces of the sections over here, and this is the best way to render it on a smaller model like this. With those little sections painted, you can see how it enhances the model and really just polishes up the lower portion of this vehicle. Nothing to mention about the sprockets. These are the stock ones. So continuing from there takes us to the track. The track is the kit supply track and was just simply painted and fitted to the model. Just like what I generally mention in these videos, the track found on these American vehicles of this era, and also started really from the World War II era, are a mix of steel and rubber, and as a modeler, it really helps to know which material is which, because this will affect how the units are painted and weathered, which also will help the look and accuracy of your build. On the Bradley links here, they're very similar to the tracks like you'll see on an M41 Walker Bulldog. In fact, that's the track that they use for the prop that was in the Pentagon Wars movie, but that's a topic for another day. The track is a steel link, so on the outside here, the whole section would be steel, and the triangular section here would be the rubber pad. On the inner portion of the track, again, it would be mostly steel, but the sections where the wheels roll on the track would actually be a rubber pad as well. So on the model over here, you can see I went ahead and rendered it accordingly, where the steel sections are painted with the rusty or the surface rust type paintwork that you see presently, and then the rubber sections are painted with Tamiya rubber black and then weathered accordingly. By painting the tracks in this type of format, it really gives a nice look to the model, and again, it just gives the model just that much more extra appeal in just colors being used, as opposed to just leaving everything in just one solid color of just flat black. And it also, again, bumps up the accuracy because it shows the different types of materials and how they would weather. Moving up from the suspension brings us to the front hull details, and mostly everything you see here is built out of the box, and all the kit components were utilized. One tweak that I made, however, were to the front shackle mounts. These are integrally molded solid on the kit. However, in order to improve it, what I did was with a pin vise, I drilled out the two center portions, which again would be more prototypical to the real unit. This, of course, needs to be done before the units are fitted in place, because once they're fitted in place, you're not exactly going to be able to squeeze your pin vise or a Dremel in here to do the procedure. Also on this section, you get to see the rubber DD skirt that's integrally molded into the model. This here was just carefully painted and weathered to the following format, and once it's painted, it really makes the model look all that much more polished compared to just leaving it with the overspray. Of course, you can leave it with the overspray. It would not be uncommon to have these things painted over in field, but this is something that, again, is just another way to help enhance the model further. If you are going to paint it in the method with the overspray, you can potentially weather it into the model, but if you're going to weather it, make sure you weather accordingly. Remember, these are rubber, not metal, so they would weather, well, like rubber. So you can have some paint chipping effects in these sections over here. As we know, painted rubber sections like that, they tend to brittle up and the paint just chips off and flakes away without any sort of problems, and even just a light breeze can start the chipping process. So that is something perhaps the builder might want to pay attention to if they want to render it in that type of format. For me, I just went with the rubber black method. But if you're going to go with the rubber black method, make sure you properly paint the straps accordingly. And moving up further, you can see the headlights right there under the bow plane. The headlights are painted with the standard colors that they would be found on the real vehicle. So we have just the standard white light on this side, and then the little indicator light painted in orange. Moving up further on the bow plane, you can see that funky, goofy grille system that was just an iconic bit of detailing found on the early versions of this vehicle. And again, you can see the kit supplied meshwork fitted in place. This is what it looks like all fully painted and weathered. Like I mentioned before, painting meshwork is something that has to be carefully done because mesh has a really bad habit of plugging up with paint. So it's something you really have to pay attention to and be on your A game with. But if you make sure everything is done appropriately, you'll have some pretty excellent result. The kit supplied mesh does the job just fine. Some people out there may try to replace it with a piece of photo etch mesh. That's something that is not necessarily something that you have to do, nor is it something that really will affect the look all that much. From what I'm seeing here, the kit mesh really does the job more or less perfectly. Moving to the side skirts, all those scratch build details that I referenced before, being the well beads as well as also those grab handles, are now really coming out in better light. As you can see, the addition of these details here really give the model just so much extra detail pop compared to leaving them omitted as they are found on the original kit offering. Same is true, of course, for the unit on the opposite side. Also, briefly jumping to the weathering, on a component like this here, Tamiya black paddle line accent is going to be your best friend. There are lots of fasteners and crevices found in these sections over here that the paddle line accent will just absolutely love to just seep into and highlight to the way you see it on this build. At the very rear of the vehicle, it takes us to the rear plate details, and again, everything you see here is stock out of the box with no mods being made. This is just purely an exercise in paintwork. So one area where I've seen a lot of people make a mistake is again with the rubber composition on some of the parts. On the Bradley, the rear mud flaps here are made out of rubber like you would see on a Mack truck on the freeway. Same is also true, by the way, on the front mud flaps right here, and as you can see on this model, I rendered them accordingly. On the rear hatch itself, we have the tow cable, and again, just careful paintwork is all that needs to be done in order to really make the thing shine. Similar can also be said about the taillights that we have right here on the top portion of these rear storage boxes. On these lights, there's two things that you have to consider. One is the actual red lens itself, and the one on the bottom is your backup light, which is a standard white light. With a careful swipe of a fine paintbrush, you'll be able to achieve these effects, and the unit already has these details integrally molded on. The only thing the builder has to do is just appropriately paint them, and basically the rest will fall into their appropriate places. As for the color, you see here is just Tamiya flat red that was then painted, getting a little ahead of ourselves, that was then swiped over with a swipe of Tamiya gloss clear, and that gives you the sheen that you see presently. Same again was also done with the lights found on the front. The front, I used Tamiya orange for the lenses, and this here was just some silver spray paint that I brushed on. Once the paint was fully set, I went over it again with the gloss clear, leaving it for the end result that you see presently. Of course, same is going to be true for the other periscopes found on the upper hull, but we'll be going over those momentarily. Moving up brings us to the upper hull detail, starting with this rack that we have here, which is used to hold on 3 7.62mm ammo cans. The cans, again, are the stock ones, and they all have their little yellow ID labeling found as a decal form, which, again, like I stated before, you have tons of on this model. Seriously, this model is more of an exercise in decal work than it is really anything else. The ammo cans, I went ahead again, painted them in different colors to just give the model a little bit more character, and again for the same reason that I mentioned before, as they are in a rainbow of different colors and tints on the real examples. The remainder of the tools are again stock, and were just simply painted accordingly. On the spare track links, they do have the rubber pad for the interior link rendered appropriately, so again you just have to paint it in the manner you see here. Everything is made out of metal. The rubber pad is painted rubber, and don't forget the straps are actually connected to the tank, so they would be the same color of the tank, or in this case the IFV. With the turret temporarily removed, you get better view of the Pioneer tools found on the upper hull sections. The tools are all the kit supply tools and went out without any sort of problems because Tamiya gonna Tamiya. When it comes to the paintwork on these tools, you want to keep something in mind that on modern military vehicles, or I should say vehicles from the 1960s and really onward to today, the tools are generally overpainted in olive green or NATO green, depending on the period that you're looking at. With this vehicle here being the early or mid 1980s, I went with Tamiya olive green for the paintwork. The tools were then weathered accordingly, where I weathered the tool heads a little bit different than I did the wooden sections for the actual handles themselves. One other thing I want to reference on the Bradley specifically is with the tool straps and posts themselves. On other vehicles, namely the U.S. military vehicles that came out before this, they were held on with nylon straps or webbing type material, and those are generally, you know, just a nylon piece of olive green webbing. However, on the Bradley, that wasn't the case. Instead, they went with these straps made out of rubber. There's like this industrial rubber, kind of like the ones you see for those thick tie-downs that they sell in truck stores and things along those lines. And these details are nicely rendered on the Tamiya kit here. The only thing you have to do is properly paint them. Again, because these are rubber, they are painted with Tamiya rubber black to give the look that you see here. And if you go ahead and render them accordingly, the pieces will definitely look really nice in the final outcome. Just like with the other sections, you can theoretically have them overpainted, but as one would imagine, after a use or two, that paint would just brittle away into oblivion, leaving the rubber material left exposed. Continuing further takes to the exhaust manifold, which is right over here. And it was just simply painted and weathered accordingly with a little bit of airbrush soot there for the exhaust. Right over here we have the fuel filler spout, and in my usual format I also went ahead and weathered it with the sweaty, drippy effects, which again wouldn't be too uncommon on a vehicle like this. On the top section, as I referenced earlier, the kit does have a very fine mesh grill integrally molded on, and you do have to be very, very careful with the paintwork. This is one of those situations, like I referenced before, where your paints need to be properly thinned out. If not, that nice little crisp detailing is going to be just obliterated by the layers of paint. So pay attention to that on your Bradley builds. And why not, since the vehicle is just demanding it, let's go ahead and show the interior. As we saw before, the rear hatch area wants to just open up at its earliest convenience. So without a whole lot of effort, the hatch will just simply drop down. The hatch is not held in place by any sort of mechanical method. It's just held in place purely by friction with these two little knobs that we have right here molded on, and they just squeeze into the vehicle's rear section. So this is something that you do have to be careful with, because just like with the M113, the hinges found on these rear hatch areas tend to be a bit on the frailer side, so you have to be careful with them, because once these things crack, repairing them is going to be very, very hard, if not impossible. So this is something that the builder really needs to pay attention to on a vehicle like this and similar to this. So again, M113s as well as the AAV7, these type of vehicles, they generally have very frail hinges, in combination with a door that just loves to open up. So as I referenced before, the interior is very nicely detailed on this older kit here. Let's go ahead and open that up for a little bit of extra light. And now that the model is fully completed, you really get to see how the interior paintwork just complements the exterior paintwork. On the rear hatch, as I mentioned before, the interior section had these two knockout marks found in this area, and here's what it looks like with those knockout marks completely removed. As you can see, this would be a very bad place to see these knockout marks present, because this is the type of vehicle that you are going to need to open it up occasionally, specifically to show and highlight the interior. So all of that kind of gets ruined and negated if you have those two big unsightly knockout marks found in this hatch over here. But fortunately, again, it's fairly easily removed. A similar story is also found here on the front. However, admittedly on the front, you are missing the internal periscope details, and this is just how the kit builds out of the box. Perhaps I might go ahead and design and tool up some 3D printed periscope inserts, and this is something I could go ahead and adjust and add at a later date, but perhaps next time I do a Bradley build, this is something to look into. But that's, potentially something for down the road. The very last thing I want to mention about the hull, and this is this model's biggest Achilles heel and pain in the ass, are the barrels for the M231 port firing weapons. These things are so ridiculously frail and fragile, and they are in such a snag-prone location that you will break them. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. Just with simple handling of this model, these things are easily swiped, and they are not forgiving. If I lost count how many times I broke these stupid things. Fortunately, I have, really good patience with gluing them back on, and when they break off clean, so the repair is fairly easily done, but this is something that will break on you. In fact, a quick note behind the scenes, while I was filming this video, I broke about 2 of them, like 2 times, from just, turning them all around and going here with the stick and my hand just maneuvering the turret, all that stuff. I literally have a bottle of super glue right here on hand, just to make sure that these things stay in proper place throughout the filming of this video. So throughout the filming of this video, the barrels should be in their appropriate place, but it's an illusion because I broke them at least once or twice, at least at the time of filming this one particular scene. So that is definitely something you need to know when you're working on one of these Tamiya Bradleys or Academy Bradleys. These things just, they just break by looking at them. I would say be careful with your build, but even with the most amount of care in the world, yeah, you're probably going to break 1 or 2 at some point. They look awesome, and they give the model so much extra detailing, but holy hell, are they very frail. So this is, luckily, with the way I display my models, it's in a display case in a nice little clear plastic box, where once it's in that box, it is immune to any sort of problems of my hands, bumping into them, or at least until I need the model for a cameo, and to which then I'll have to keep the bottle of super glue on hand. That's all there is to the hull. That brings us directly to the turret. So the turret on the Tamiya kit goes together very, very well. And again, it's just a nicely engineered component with the way everything is layered out. One interesting quirk that this kit does have, though, is with the main armament. When you first build a model, the unit can't elevate up and down, much along the lines as most other tank models out there. However, when you mount on the optic holder, you lose the ability for the unit to operate. And this is just a quirk found on the old Tamiya Bradley kit. With the way the unit's molded, it's only molded to stay in this one direction, with the barrel more or less pointed in a somewhat above straight line elevated state. And the piece on the real one, of course, is articulated and hinged, so it goes up and down in unison. However, to render and mold that in 1/35 scale, specifically in the 80s, was probably something that wasn't very feasible, so they just simply rendered it in the static position that you see here. Also, there's no other option available, so it's not like they have, you know, like 2 or 3 of these at different elevations in order to render the barrel in a different type of format. It's just the one and done. So if you are building one of these models and you want to render it with, say, the unit elevated to a certain degree, this is something that you are going to have to make some modifications to in order to replicate that effect. Continuing further takes us to the barrel section. This is the kit supplied Bushmaster, and on this one here I rendered it like the real example that was found on the box, where the main tube section is painted in a Parkerized type look, but the flash suppressor over here, or I should say the muzzle brake, is left in the white. And I went ahead and simply just painted it with some Vallejo oily silver, I believe is the color that I use, in order to get the look that you see here. Of course, a little bit of Tamiya panel line accent was used to get those grills to pop out, which is nice that they are integrally molded on, and for something like this, the panel line accent is definitely, again, going to be your best friend. And as I mentioned before, the muzzle section was drilled out with the pin vise, leading for a very nice effect. On the coax, we see here the tip of the M240, and you'll notice it's painted red. Again, this is as per the box art, because the unit in the box art and also the examples of the real Bradley that are found on the side of the box are depicting it in a exercise, and so the M240 has a blank barrel attachment fitted in place, and the blank BFA is red in color to prevent any sort of mix-up and confusion. So on this model here, I wanted to go ahead and render it in that format. It's a bit different compared to all the other builds that I've done, where generally I build the armament in, you know, its standard configuration. For this one, I wanted to do something a little bit different, also to pay homage to the box art. So for this one here, I just rendered it in the red color that you see, but that doesn't mean I can't weather it accordingly, because if anyone knows a thing or two about BFAs, they get dirty very, very quickly. Moving down brings us to the smoke grenade launchers. These are just your standard USGI smoke grenade type fittings. And again, one thing to mention is that the tips found on the tube sections are made out of rubber. This would include the conical section on the top, as well as that larger sleeve section that we see right there on the bottom. All these details are integrally molded on. You just have to appropriately paint them. Once they are painted, however, they look very, very good. Carrying on further takes us to the clear plastic sight, and this is a very nice bit of detailing that's applied only on the Tamiya example. The Academy version of this kit is emitting the clear runner, so you're basically left on your own pounding sand trying to scratch build that part out of some scrap clear plastic. And there's a reason why I know that, but regardless, the Tamiya one here, that's not the case. The Tamiya one gives you a little fret of clear plastic that has this section as well as the optic over here punched out, so you simply just have to carefully snip it off with an X-Acto, and then you could glue these two units into their appropriate locations. Because they are clear plastic, you want to be careful with the glues that you use. This is not the type of thing you want to use super glue on, because of the propensity of having that gassy white stuff that could just ruin something that's made out of clear plastic. So on this one here, I actually use just standard white glue. White glue is used to glue this guy in place, as well as the inner one. On the outer one, in addition to the part being glued on, there is actually a decal for the sight that is supplied with the kit. Again, Tamiya was really on their A game with this one. The decal went on without any sort of problems, but to seal everything in place, I actually went ahead and coated the entire clear plastic section with the clear gloss lacquer. This is something very different compared to the other decals that are secured on with the VMS. This is not something you want VMS. This is something that you want to be nice and shiny, so the lacquer was the way to go, and it acts the same way as the varnish. Of course, this is like literally the very last thing that gets glued onto this model after the varnishing is fully concluded, for a reason that should be fairly obvious. The next bit of detailing is with the optic for the tow missile launcher. This can be rendered in two configurations. You can have it with the shutters in the closed state, and you can render like I did here with them in the open state. Obviously, if they're in the open state, they're going to give the model much more extra detailing. And the clear plastic sections are very nice that they are rendered, and they are again glued from the inside of the model, and white glue was again used for the reasons that I just mentioned. The one thing that I do want to reference though is that if you are installing them in the open state, it would be best to paint the inside portion of the turret flat black, just even in this little box area over here, just because with the size of these windows here, you will see inside, and it will look kind of weird to have just that, you know, flesh colored plastic poking out through the optics, as opposed to something like you see here, where again, painted in black, and it just, the only thing you see is a nice sheen of the clear plastic, and it just yields for some better, more realistic results. The other thing I want to mention with the optic is that you typically see these in the open position when the tow missile launcher is deployed and is about to fire the tow, obviously. So the tow can be rendered on this kit in two configurations, in the retracted mode and in deployed mode. And no, there's no like way in between. Oddly enough, when I was 18, I first built one of these models, I actually was able to make the thing function where it was adjustable. The thing would open and close, and this unit here actually would pivot with the unit, but that's something that I did back then, and it's not something I was too lazy on this one. I'm like, I'll just leave it in the open spot on this one. But it is something that's theoretically possible, and you know, perhaps I'll show that in this video. But regardless, here's the tow missile launcher. When you are building one of these, you want to make sure that the power cord is painted. It's not really a power cord, it's actually the sheath for the hydraulic ram that's used to elevate and depress this thing. There's this like rubber accordion tube sleeve thing that's over the hydraulic ram, giving you that iconic look. And for this one here, I just simply painted it with the color that you see here, which, if I'm not mistaken, again, is Tamiya rubber black. For the remainder of the paintwork, for the front sections of the toes, they are painted in flat black. This was lifted off of some real examples of the Bradley with its tow missile in the upper position, like you see here, that I got off of the internet. And on the rear portion here, you could also see the paintwork found on the rear example. Just like with all the other details that you paint separately and paint in slightly different colors, it just adds to the overall look of the model, and again gives it just a little bit of extra spice. Moving to the gypsy rack takes us to the ammo can holders as well as the ammo cans themselves, and as you can see, this thing is just littered with 7.62mm ammo cans. Again, same thing I mentioned before, they are painted in different colors and they all have their decals present and found in place. From there brings us to the antenna bases, and these are painted in a slightly darker shade of olive drab, which would not be uncommonly seen of these type of antenna bases specifically for this era. And the wire has been added in place, which is just simple floor wire that was drilled into these two sections over here and then just fitted in place, leaving for the results that you see. Continuing upward brings us to the hatches. These are the kit supplied hatches, and even though there is no turret interior on the turret itself, the hatches are still fully functional. And they do have their interior detailing found with the headrest pad found on the center portion of the hatch. Same is also true for the one on the opposite side. Even though I didn't paint the interior of the turret or detail it out, I might as well go ahead and paint the interior portions of the hatches as a why not bit of detailing. The detailing is integrally molded on, so I might as well just go ahead and finish it off. Also in this section over here, you get to see the other optic right over there dead center, and just a little swipe of gloss black was used to get the effect that you see. The one very last thing I want to mention on the turret is with the gypsy rack. Like I stated before, I drilled out all the perforations, and hopefully you can see the light coming out through the opposite side. And once it's done, it just yields for a very nice and natural look. If you do not drill those out, Tamiya panel line accent is going to be your best friend in that regard as well, and it really gets in there to make the units look deeper and hollow. But if you just drill them out like I referenced, that's really not as necessary. And that's all there is for the external details, and this takes us to the paint and the markings. So for the model's paint work, for this one here, I went with something a bit different compared to some of the other models that I've done from the late Cold War era. You'll note that this one here is all in a single tone of a olive drab type color. And this was, again, homage to the box art, to the real vehicle found on the side, and also to that really kick-ass version of this kit that I saw in that model show all those years ago. Which, by the way, he, I believe, did the same modification to the grab handles like I did in this example, but that's neither here nor there. For the paintwork, I started with, well, first with the color itself. Like, I generally mentioned during the late 1970s into the 1980s time frame, the US was in a transition moving from olive drab to the camouflage pattern being either the Merc and then later on the three-tone NATO. It wouldn't be until very recently is when the U.S. Army would be switching back to a mono color of a green, solid green, like we see on some more recent vehicles that are, floating around today. But in this era over here, there was, again, that transitional period, so you would see some vehicles in a monotone color green like this example here. So for the green itself, I actually started off with my exterior latex post-World War II or late World War II olive drab. This is the same color that you've seen on a multitude of different vehicles found on this channel, and I figured that was a good base to start with. Of course, before that paint went on, the entire model was thoroughly primed with flat black spray paint for the reasons that I always mention and I've already touched upon in this video. The remainder of the paint work is then a cocktail of all sorts of different colors that were added on as washes in order to get the look that you see here. The cocktail consisted of layers of white, cream, olive drab from Tamiya, a few shades of olive green and olive drab from Mission in different orders and on top of each other over and over again. I was actually just literally winging it just to see if I could get the look that I was desiring. And I had the box art next to me the entire time, just trying to get the color as close as possible to the one on the box and also to the one I saw at the show. And this here is the end result. Sadly, I cannot elaborate any further on the actual ratios and the mixes and the order of which the paints were applied because honestly, I don't remember. It was seat of my pants type paintwork, and the final outcome is this here, so I must have had a muse in the shop with me at the time. But regardless, I am really stoked at how the final paintwork came out. This is exactly what I envisioned when I first took this build on and when I first bought the model all those years ago. So the remainder of the weathering work is done in my usual format, which is, again, the counter shading done with the airbrush, as well as also some dry brushing used for the chipping and other effects. Like I stated before, to me, a panel line accent is definitely going to be your best friend, and it was just used to give the model more depth on all of the little crevices, fasteners, and other amenities that are found on the model. It really just makes the model look all that much more improved. The decals on the model here are the kit supplied water slide decals, and they went out without any sort of problems. The ones that were left from the interior, of course, were saved for the external portion of the vehicle, and the external has a decent number of decals as well. There are a plethora of decals, and the kit gives you options for two types of Bradleys. One with the Merc pattern, but this one here, I definitely wanted to go with the 56. The 56 on the real vehicle is actually like printed plastic. It's kind of like a plastic bag, and it's literally duct taped to the side of the vehicle. So that's the look that we see here. Why this is important is on the side section where we have the slit lines of the tin work, you don't want to have the slit line found on this area over here because, again, this thing is nothing more than a plastic bag duct taped to the side of the vehicle's armor. So that's why, if you'll notice, I did not go ahead and carve that little line in this section over here, nor did I try to weather it in with the weathering techniques that I just referenced. In addition to the 56, the remainder of the decals all went on accordingly, and again, they went out without any sort of problems. You just have to take your time and make sure that you're applying them on in all the appropriate areas and that they are, fully dried by the time you go ahead and add the sealant, which in this case is VMS matte varnish. The VMS went on and leaves for the final results that you see here. Also, one other thing that I really enjoyed about this version of the Bradley with this paintwork is with the white painted rear sections of the boxes. This is, again, as we saw on the box art, and it just looks awesome and killer, so I went ahead and painted it. The white here is just exterior latex house paint that was thinned down, so that was nice and thin, and it allowed me to apply with the paintbrush in a nice flat format. And then it was just weathered into the remainder of the paintwork that you see here. But one thing that is not really well mentioned on the instructions is with the front section. So we all know that the rear sections are painted in white, but the one thing that was a bit of a surprise to me, and I found out basically almost at the tail end of the paintwork, was that the front transmission bulge area are painted white as well. So this is something you want to pay attention to if you're building the vehicle in this format. Fortunately, it was a very simple add-on to do. I just simply went ahead, painted these sections with the white, and then just blended it in with the weathering via the airbrush and the dry brushing that I already referenced. Once it's fully added and fully blended in, it yields for some excellent results here, and it makes for a nice, unique appearance of the Bradley, and it's very different compared to the camouflage versions that we've seen, you know, in the years that followed. And that's all there is to mention about this particular build. However, there is something that I do want to mention, and again, I've already referenced it several times in this video, and that is, back in the day, the Tamiya was not the only option available for an M2 Bradley, specifically one with the interior. If you did not have the money for the Tamiya 1, or if you just couldn't straight up find the Tamiya 1, the other alternative was the version from Academy, and back in 2003, I actually built an example. This here is the Academy 1/35 scale M2 Bradley with full interior. This guy here I built back when I was 18 years old and has been sitting in a dark enclave in the shop literally ever since. So this one here didn't get the OTR treatment. The model itself is built fine. I just went ahead and polished it up in some areas. Like, for instance, I corrected some mistakes that I made over the, you know, all those years ago. Like, for instance, the composition of the tin board or the muff flaps. I thought they were metal, and obviously they're rubber, so I went ahead and quickly took care of that. Cleaned up any sort of dust on the surface, and I also went ahead and painted the DD sections appropriately on this one. Again, like the more modern counterpart. But regardless, this kit, quality-wise, is literally almost identical to the Tamiya 1. The only area where Academy skimped are with the decals and also with the clear plastic parts. The clear plastic parts that I mentioned that are supplied with the Tamiya are just not found on the Academy counterpart. Instead, the clear sections that you see on this model over here were actually fabricated by myself. So the inner toe section, that is a piece of clear plastic from a cookie, you know, styrene that was in the recycle bin, as was the optic. And on this one here, I painted the little crosshair with a fine point Sharpie, if memory serves. All those years later, the piece still stayed on. As for the interior, again, full interior detailing on this one. And it's the exact same interior that was found on the Tamiya example. And now the one time I want the thing to open, it doesn't. And of course I broke the M231. That's okay, the glues are still soft. And open this guy up here. So, here you get to see the two interiors. On this one here, I use a slightly different color. I used a Testors or Model Master blue color, and this was basically the color I used for the longest time until very recently switching over to Tamiya Sky for the seafoam green. But, you know, for the time, it did the job. And in fact, I've utilized this fairly recently on some of my more recent builds. But again, like I say in those videos, I have seen interiors painted with a color similar to this. So it's not entirely inaccurate. But needless to say, it's not something I'm going to be using in the future. But as for the quality of the parts themselves, like I stated before, literally carbon copy, exact replica of the Tamiya tooling. The one area where the Tamiya kit is a little bit more finely molded is with the M231s. The Tamiya actually has much better detailing found on the muzzle brake here, and it actually looks like an A1 birdcage, while on the Academy it's more or less an amorphous little lump found on the end. Again, you know, it's good enough for the job, but the Tamiya one is better in that regard. Also, the hat trick on this build, like I mentioned before, was I made the toe section operable. So here you get to see it in deployed state, and there it is in the retracted state, or as retracted as I can get it. So yes, 18-year-old John was able to figure that out back then, and late 30-something-year-old John just said, screw it, I'm just going to leave it in the open position. The ambition of youth. So the way I did it was, with the way the kit is designed, it's actually hinged, and the thing is a natural hinge. You have to permanently glue it in place in order to make it in the fixed position. In order to do this modification, what I did was I actually used a thick piece of wire down here, electrical wire, and that replaced the hydraulic ram setup that's supplied with the kit, and the wire is flexible yet stiff. So when I open it up, it stays in the open position, and when I push it down, it just pops out of the hinge because it's very stiff. There we go. And it just goes into downward space. The second modification was made to the little door. In order to have the door pivot, I actually went ahead and extended it by gluing, and this is done with tester's red tube, I think. No, this part's super glue. But here you can see the long stem. This long stem was done on purpose because this is much harder for it to fall out if the stem was shorter. And it's obviously just held in place with gravity. So this slides back into that little hole. And it skewers in there. It kind of works in the downward position. Sometimes it hangs up with friction. That was the one thing that I always had trouble with, and that's probably the reason why I'm like, screw it, I'll just leave in the open spot on this one. But regardless, when it opens up though, you can see that gravity naturally keeps it in the downward position, like the way you see it here. The other modification that I made to this one, again, was with the Bushmaster. Like I stated before, you have the elevation set at one height, but on this one here, I said, nah, I could go ahead and modify that. And the way this was done was I add a small little incision right over here at this elbow, so that when you elevate the Bushmaster, it can still elevate, although the rest of it stays static, but the piece can still go up and down like you see here. So again, this was another little like hack I did back in the day. Didn't do it on the other one. I'm like, I'll just, I don't really mess with it anyway. But again, if you want to modify your Bradley to have those animations, that is something you could potentially look into. Also, while I'm at, you can see, 18-year-old John was adding the yellow marks on the ammo cans even back then. Remember, the Academy one does not have the little decals for this information, and so this is something I'll just add with a paintbrush. As I mentioned before, this is going to be a longer format video, so adding an extra minute or two at this point doesn't really make a difference. And if you made it to this point in the video, I want to say thank you. You are awesome. And I am going to give you a gift for your perseverance and patience, and that is with a guest cameo. As I mentioned before, Tamiya released this kit of the Bradley in the mid-1980s. Around the exact same time, the US Army adopted and fielded the real M2 and M3 Bradley. However, they adopted and fielded several other new pieces of equipment at the exact same time, and I always figured that the Bradley was basically Robin in the dynamic duo, so who of course would be Batman? Well, that would be none other than the M1 Abrams. And to make matters even more interesting, the Abrams model that we have here is another vintage kit from the exact same time period and was also released at the same time the US Army adopted and also started fielding the real counterpart. It's also important to mention that these two kits, chances are, would have been on the store shelves at the exact same time, in people's collections at the same time, and also they probably would have been in dioramas helping each other at the exact same time. This here is the original release M1 Abrams kit from Eschi. Tamiya themselves would release an M1 in the exact same format, however, that is something for another video, but I already have this older kit on hand, so I might as well go ahead and give him the cameo. Also, you'll notice this one is painted in the mono color of green as well. Slightly different tint from the Bradley, but regardless, the two you can see definitely complement and work with each other quite nicely. And although the two kits would have been in competition with one another, and admittedly the Tamiya one is a little bit more refined compared to the Eschi counterpart, regardless, these two vintage 80s kits here definitely complement each other very nicely when placed on the table side by side, and it's great to have an example of both in my collection. At the end of the day, there is not any possible way this build couldn't have turned out any better. I had an absolute blast working on this model over here, and this was a really enjoyable build from start all the way to finish. Completing this build over here does have several aspects that make it feel also great. One is that this was an old stash inhabitant. This thing has been loitering in the stash now for far too long, so finally getting to it and building it up to this condition over here, no less, it always feels good. But this one definitely feels all that much more better, because if I would have tried to build this model a number of years earlier, I doubt it would have turned out as good as the way you see it here. So definitely, like I frequently mention in the video similar to this, it's better they got to it later rather than sooner. Also, just like how I mentioned before, that this is a model from my youth. I would always see these things and lust for them in the Tamiya catalogs, and I would see them in the Squadron catalogs and all that good stuff, but I never crossed paths with one. So finally obtaining one, building it up, and adding it to the collection, it is also a feeling of accomplishment in that regard as well. This kit here is one of those kits that really did age like fine wine. First, this model is just as relevant today as it was when it first came out all those years ago. Even though we are almost at the 40-year mark upon release of this kit, There has yet to be another more modern recent tooling kit that is of a vehicle of this exact pattern. Yes, there are several newer edition Bradley kits on the market. However, those all depict a version of the Bradley that is more contemporary, either with the Busk add-ons or just a standard M2A2 or something along those lines. But the original, as released Bradley from the 1980s, this one here is still, as far as I know, the only game in town. And yes, I'm also lumping in the Academy kit because it's literally the same tooling. But regardless, this kit here is still relevant in that regard. Also, with the way this model aged, it just keeps up with the modern market. This kit here is an excellent model. On some aspects of this build, I was actually taken back and surprised on the complexity as well as just the level of detailing that's applied on this model. And again, with the parameters of the era that this kit was produced in, this model here would have been the super kit of the time. And I think this kit, if it's not it's definitely a contender for one of the most super detailed kits that was released at that particular period. Which again lent to itself to why it's still as relevant today as it was back then. So this kit really is mostly future-proof in that regard. And again, you can take this kit here, add upon it, and it'll just polish it up all that much more. Obviously, after working on this one here, I would absolutely love to pick up the M3 version, but that's a topic for another video for another day. This is the perfect point to pivot us into skill level and recommendation. So right off the bat, someone's going to see this video and they're going to say, hey, this is a Tamiya kit. Tamiya kits are great. They're really easy to build. Is this something that I could tackle as a beginner? And the answer is, for this particular version here, the answer is actually a no. A beginner is going to have some difficulty putting this model together. Not necessarily in terms of actual construction, that part's really easy. But where this model becomes problematic for a beginner is with the level of paint work and also the decal work that's required in order to get this one fully completed. As we saw earlier, the devil is definitely in the details in the interior, and this is something that the builder really needs to have some experience in order to fully bring this model up to its full potential. If you are a beginner and you really love this pattern of vehicle, I would recommend the Tamiya M3 kit or the M2A2 because those two releases are basically the exact same kit here, specifically in regards to the old school M3, but sans the interior. Without the interior in place, this thing becomes a pussycat, and yes, it is beginner friendly in that regard. But with this version here, with the interior, you want to pump your brakes, and this is basically left up for someone who is an intermediate builder. Obviously, an advanced range builder can tackle one of these models practically with their eyes closed, but they may feel that the kit's a bit antiquated in some areas, specifically compared to some other kits that they're used to. And if you are an advanced builder, yeah, you could definitely tackle one of these models, but perhaps, and if you are one of those type of people that tend to piss and moan about everything, well, you're unappeasable. But if that's you, perhaps you may want to steer more towards one of the more modern super kits like the Mang version of the M3 that was released a little while ago. That too has a full interior. It's probably going to be a better build in that regard. But circling back to what I mentioned earlier, if you're looking for an old school first generation 1980s era Bradley, the Tamiya is the only option available on hand. And that's going to be basically your best option for that regard. But if you are an advanced builder, well, there are plenty of aftermarket details that you could cobble together and add to this model over here in order to spruce it up compared to the stock offering that you see here on the table. Circling back to what I mentioned before, an intermediate builder can build one of these models without any sort of problems. This is definitely a firm intermediate build. It has the simplicity of the kit from the version I mentioned that's great for a beginner, but has just a little bit more complexity to it that should keep you on your toes, and again, it'll actually surprise you with just how much work it takes in order to flesh out the interior. So if you're one of those people that are looking for a build that, takes a little bit longer than a day or two to put together, oddly enough, this one here is probably going to be recommended for you. And that is the perfect point to slide us now into recommendations. So first and foremost, if you are a fan of Cold War vehicles or just American vehicles in general, the Tamiya M2 Bradley is definitely recommended. If you're the type of person that loves model tanks with full interior details, this is also going to be a kit that you're going to enjoy immensely. Another person who I'd recommend this model to would be anyone who is a fan of armored personnel carriers or infantry fighting vehicles. If you're the type of guy that digs the M113, the Marine AAV7, or the Russian BMP 1 and 2, well, this kit here is definitely one that would be highly recommended. Along similar lines, if you're a vet and you rode around in these vehicles in the Gulf War or even back in the 80s when they were in this type of configuration, you're probably going to have a soft spot for this vehicle. I'm pretty sure you're going to want to have one in your collection if you already don't at this point. Another person I'd recommend this kit to would be anyone who's into building dioramas. Because of the interior setup on this kit here, this definitely lends itself for that type of application. You can depict this model in a multitude of different ways with the interior being utilized as a focal point for your scene. Of course, this kit is a vintage model kit and a vintage Tamiya kit no less, which definitely opens up another type of collector. If you're into building and collecting vintage model kits, or if you're into collecting Tamiya kits in general, this kit here should definitely be on your hit list if it isn't already so. The very last person who I'd recommend this kit to is along similar lines to the veteran of these vehicles that I mentioned before, and that is if you're an avid fan of the Bradley family. If you have some of the modern tooling kits on the market that I referenced before, it would be a really great idea to add this one and also the Tamiya M3 to your collection, just as a way to just, fill it in and flesh it out further. The newer kits are awesome, but again, there's just something about having a vehicle in your series that depicts it from its very early adoption point, as well as one from its, current latest and greatest point, not to mention a few in between. It's just a way to really flesh out your collection and just make it all that much more solid. And with that, that wraps up this model showcase video for this 1/35th scale US M2 Bradley infantry fighting vehicle. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel, where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being smaller scale model showcase videos like this one over here, as well as the other larger scale project update videos that frequently get posted to this channel. Another way to keep in loop with new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There, I have more photographs of this particular model, as well as the other smaller and larger scale builds that have been seen on this channel in the past. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Thanks again. I'll be seeing you all again on the next one. Till then.